Here is a medical test scenario. A disease affects 1 in 1,000 people. There is a test for the disease that is 99% accurate, meaning it correctly identifies the disease when it is present 99% of the time, and correctly comes back negative when the disease is absent 99% of the time. You take the test, it comes back positive. What is the probability that you actually have the disease?
Most people's instinct is 99%. The test is 99% accurate. You tested positive, so you almost certainly have the disease.
The actual answer is just under 9%. And if you feel a jolt of disorientation right now, if that number seems impossible, if you want to go back and check the problem, that reaction is exactly what this episode is about. Our intuitions about probability are not just slightly off. They are systematically, predictably, catastrophically wrong in ways that affect our medical decisions, our legal judgments, our financial choices, and our assessment of risk in almost every domain of life.
Welcome to Philosophy for Lunch. I'm Claire.
And I'm Shawn. Today we are in the strange and certain pillar, the territory where rigorous thinking produces results that genuinely surprise us. We are talking about probability. What it is, why we get it wrong so reliably, what Bayes' theorem reveals about how we should update our beliefs, how Pascal used probability to argue for God, and what all of this means for the examined life. New episodes every Monday. Big ideas, human conversations. Let's go.
Before we get into why we get probability wrong, it is worth spending a moment on what probability actually is, because the concept is less straightforward than it appears, and the philosophical debates about its foundations are genuinely interesting.
There are two main interpretations of probability that have competed in the philosophy of mathematics and the philosophy of science for the last 3 centuries. The first is the frequentist interpretation. Probability is a property of the real world, specifically of the long-run frequency of outcomes in repeated trials. The probability of a fair coin coming up heads is 1/2, because in a very large number of flips, it will come up heads approximately half the time. On this view, probability is objective and empirical. It describes something about the world that can, in principle, be measured.
The second interpretation is the Bayesian one. Probability is a measure of degree of belief, specifically of rational credence in a proposition given the evidence available. On this view, probability is not primarily a feature of the world, but a feature of an agent's epistemic state. When we say the probability of rain tomorrow is 70%, we are not claiming that 30% of identical tomorrows in identical weather conditions will be sunny. We are expressing a degree of confidence, grounded in evidence, that rain will occur.
The Bayesian interpretation has become increasingly dominant in statistics, cognitive science, and the philosophy of science over the last several decades, and for good reason. Many of the probability statements we care about most, the probability that a defendant is guilty, the probability that a medical hypothesis is true, the probability that a policy will have a desired effect, are not naturally understood as long-run frequencies. They are assessments of confidence given evidence. And the Bayesian framework gives us rigorous tools for thinking about how that confidence should be updated as new evidence arrives.
Thomas Bayes was an 18th century English minister and mathematician who developed the theorem that bears his name. He never published it during his lifetime. It was published posthumously by his friend Richard Price in 1763. The core idea is simple but profound. The probability that a hypothesis is true, given some evidence, is a function of how probable the evidence would be if the hypothesis were true, how probable the evidence would be if the hypothesis were false, and how probable the hypothesis was before the evidence arrived.
That last component, the prior probability, or simply, the prior is the key to the medical test problem in the opening. Before you took the test, the probability that you had the disease was 1 in 1,000.1%. The test is very accurate. But starting from such a low prior probability means that even a positive result does not move the posterior probability very far. Working through the arithmetic, out of every 1,000 people tested, 1 actually has the disease and will almost certainly test positive. But 9 or 10 of the 999 healthy people will also test positive because no test is perfect. So of the 10 or 11 people who test positive, only 1 actually has the disease. That is roughly 9%.
The lesson is not that the test is useless. It is that the interpretation of the test result depends entirely on the prior probability on how likely the disease was before the test. For a patient with symptoms strongly associated with the disease, the prior might be much higher, and a positive test becomes much more informative. For a population being screened without symptoms, where the disease is rare, even a very accurate test produces mostly false positives. This is why medical screening for rare conditions is so complicated. and why the naive interpretation of test results, 99% accurate, means 99% certain, can be genuinely dangerous.
We covered cognitive biases in some depth earlier in this show, and probability is the domain where those biases do some of their most serious damage. Let me run through the most consequential ones, because I think understanding them specifically, not just abstractly, is what makes the difference.
The first is the base rate neglect we just saw in the medical test problem. When we receive specific information, a positive test result, a witness identification, a news story, we tend to anchor on that information and neglect the prior probability that should be shaping our interpretation. This is related to what Kahneman calls the substitution heuristic. We answer the easy question, how accurate is this test? Rather than the harder one, given how rare this disease is, what does the positive result actually tell me?
The prosecutor's fallacy is a particularly important and particularly dangerous version of base rate neglect. It arises in criminal trials when statistical evidence is misinterpreted. The classic case: a DNA test shows a match between a suspect and evidence from a crime scene, and the expert witness testifies that the probability of this match occurring by chance is 1 in a million. The jury hears the probability that this person is innocent is 1 in a million, but those are not the same statement. The probability of a random match given innocence is 1 in a million. The probability of innocence given a match depends also on how many potential suspects there are, how the suspect was identified, and other factors the 1 in a million figure says nothing about.
The Sally Clark case in Britain is one of the most heartbreaking illustrations of this. Clark was a solicitor convicted in 1999 of murdering her 2 infant sons, both of whom had died of what appeared to be sudden infant death syndrome. A statistician testified that the probability of 2 sudden infant death syndrome deaths in the same family was 1 in 73 million, a figure arrived at by squaring the probability of a single such death, assuming the 2 events were independent. The jury convicted. Clark spent 3 years in prison before her conviction was overturned. After it was established that the statistical analysis was flawed in multiple ways, including the assumption of independence, when in fact biological and environmental factors mean second, sudden infant death syndrome deaths in the same family are considerably more likely than the calculation assumed. She never recovered psychologically from her imprisonment and died of acute alcohol intoxication in 2007.
The gambler's fallacy is the mirror image of base rate neglect. Where base rate neglect makes us ignore prior probabilities, the gambler's fallacy makes us believe that independent events are connected when they are not. A coin comes up heads 5 times in a row. The gambler thinks tails is due. The probability of heads is 50%. The coin has no memory. The fact that it has come up heads 5 consecutive times does not alter the probability of the next flip. Each flip is independent. The intuition that a streak creates a debt that the universe owes you a correction is deeply embedded and completely wrong.
The availability heuristic, which we covered in the cognitive bias episode, is especially powerful in the domain of risk assessment. We judge the probability of an event by how easily examples of it come to mind. Plane crashes are vivid, emotionally salient, and heavily covered by media, so we overestimate the probability of dying in a plane crash and underestimate the probability of dying in a car accident, which is statistically far more common. Terrorism is overestimated as a risk. Heart disease is underestimated. The salience of an event in our imagination is not a reliable guide to its frequency in the world.
The Sally Clark case is also a window into something philosophically important about the relationship between statistics and narrative. The statistical evidence, 1 in 73 million, was compelling in the way that large numbers are always compelling. But it was presented in isolation from the narrative context that would have made it interpretable. What is the background rate of false accusations in child death cases? What does the medical literature actually say about sudden infant death syndrome recurrence within families? Those questions require the base rate reasoning that Bayesian thinking demands, and that was conspicuously absent from the courtroom. Statistics without base rates are not just incomplete, they are actively misleading.
The forensic use of probability has improved significantly since the Clark case, partly because of the sustained philosophical and legal work done in its aftermath. Courts now generally require expert witnesses to address base rates explicitly, and there are developed guidelines for presenting probabilistic evidence in ways that reduce the likelihood of the prosecutor's fallacy and its mirror image the defense attorney's fallacy, which involves the error of treating a low probability of a match as itself exculpatory, without considering the prior probability of guilt. Getting probability right in the courtroom is not just a technical problem. It is a justice problem.
And then there is overconfidence, the tendency to assign higher probabilities to our own beliefs than the evidence warrants, and to be more certain about predictions than we should be. Studies consistently show that when people say they are 95% confident in an answer, they are right about 70% of the time. Experts in many domains, economists, political scientists, doctors, are frequently overconfident in their predictions. Philip Tetlock's work on forecasting, summarized in his book Super Forecasting, suggests that most experts are not significantly better at probabilistic prediction than educated laypeople, and that the best forecasters are distinguished not by expertise, but by epistemic humility, by their willingness to express genuine uncertainty and update their estimates frequently as new information arrives.
I want to turn to one of the most famous and most philosophically interesting uses of probabilistic reasoning in the history of philosophy, Pascal's wager, because it illustrates both the power and the limits of applying probability to the largest questions.
Blaise Pascal was a 17th century French mathematician, physicist, and philosopher, a genuinely extraordinary intellect who made foundational contributions to probability theory, fluid mechanics, and projective geometry, and who underwent a profound religious conversion in his mid-30s that shaped the rest of his life. His posthumously published Pensées Thoughts in French contains the wager argument, which is probably the most famous decision-theoretic argument for religious belief ever made.
The argument runs roughly like this: you cannot know with certainty whether God exists, but you must choose how to live, belief or non-belief, without that certainty. So the choice is a wager. If you wager on God's existence, and God exists, you gain eternal life, infinite reward. If you wager on God's existence and God does not exist, you lose some finite goods, pleasures, and freedoms you gave up in living a religious life. If you wager against God's existence and God does not exist, you gain those finite goods. If you wager against God's existence and God does exist, you face eternal damnation, infinite loss. The expected value calculation is straightforward. Infinite reward times any positive probability is infinite. Any finite loss is finite. Therefore, you should wager on God's existence.
The argument is elegant and has generated centuries of philosophical response. The most powerful objection is what is sometimes called the many gods problem. Pascal assumes a specific theological picture, the Christian God who rewards belief and punishes non-belief. But there are many possible gods with different reward structures. A God who rewards sincere inquiry and punishes vain belief would recommend the opposite of Pascal's strategy. A God who rewards a different religion would make Pascal's wager actively harmful. Once you multiply the possible gods, the expected value calculation becomes vastly more complicated, and the clean dominance argument dissolves.
The second major objection is about the nature of belief. Pascal assumes that you can simply decide to believe that wagering on God is enough, but belief is not typically a direct object of will. You cannot simply choose to believe something you find implausible, any more than you can choose to find something funny. Pascal was aware of this and had a response. Begin by acting as if you believe. Attend church, practice the rituals, and belief will follow from habit and practice. This is actually a psychologically sophisticated point. There is genuine evidence that behavior shapes belief as much as belief shapes behavior. But it raises its own philosophical problems about the authenticity of belief arrived at through deliberate self-manipulation.
William James, whose will to believe we covered last week, was both influenced by and critical of Pascal. He agreed that in certain forced, live, and momentous decisions, passional commitment is legitimate. But he objected to Pascal's purely calculative approach, the idea that religious belief can be justified by an expected value argument. James thought genuine religious belief required something more than a bet. It required an actual live hypothesis, a genuine openness in the believer, and an experience that the belief was tracking something real. The Jamesian will to believe is not Pascal's wager. It is considerably more psychologically and epistemologically demanding.
There's a third objection to Pascal's wager that I find philosophically important, and it has to do with the structure of infinite values in decision theory. Pascal's argument works because infinite reward times any positive probability, however small, is infinite, and therefore dominates any finite consideration. But this structure creates problems that go beyond the many gods objection. If we allow infinite values into our decision calculus, almost any action can be justified by constructing a sufficiently exotic theological scenario in which it produces infinite reward. The expected value framework breaks down when infinite utilities are in play, because infinite expected values cannot be meaningfully compared or traded off against each other.
Contemporary decision theorists have spent considerable effort trying to construct versions of Pascal's wager that avoid these problems, versions that produce the same conclusion without invoking actual infinities. The results are technically sophisticated, but none of them has the clean, intuitive force of the original. What Pascal's wager does, at its best, is force us to think seriously about the asymmetry between the costs and benefits of religious commitment. The question of whether the goods that come from a life of religious commitment community, meaning ethical structure, the comfort of belief, are worth the costs of that commitment, even in the absence of certainty about God's existence, is a serious one. It just does not have the clean mathematical answer Pascal wanted to give it.
I want to move from the abstract to the practical to what Bayesian reasoning actually looks like as an orientation to everyday life, because I think this is where the philosophy of probability pays off most directly for the examined life.
The core Bayesian practice is updating taking your current beliefs as priors and revising them in response to evidence, proportionally to how strongly that evidence bears on the question. This sounds simple and is surprisingly hard. The difficulty is not primarily mathematical, it is psychological. We have strong motivated resistance to revising beliefs we are attached to, especially when the evidence bears on our identity, our relationships, or our worldview.
The confirmation bias we covered in the cognitive bias episode is the systematic failure of Bayesian updating. We tend to seek out evidence that confirms our existing beliefs, interpret ambiguous evidence as confirming, and discount or ignore evidence that disconfirms. The result is that we become more confident in our beliefs over time, regardless of whether the evidence actually supports increasing confidence. This is not just a failure of reasoning, it is a failure of intellectual honesty, and it is one that the examined life specifically requires us to resist.
What does good Bayesian practice actually look like? Philip Tetlock's research on superforecasters gives some concrete answers. The best probabilistic reasoners share a cluster of habits. They express their beliefs in numerical probabilities rather than vague qualifiers. Not, it is unlikely, but I think there is about a 20% chance. They update their estimates frequently as new information arrives, and they update in both directions, increasing and decreasing confidence as the evidence warrants. They actively seek out disconfirming evidence and take it seriously. They have what Tetlock calls a growth mindset about their own reasoning. They track their predictions, notice where they go wrong, and try to understand why.
The philosopher of science, Imre Lakatos, introduced a concept he called the protective belt, the set of auxiliary assumptions that scientists use to shield their core theoretical commitments from disconfirming evidence. When an experiment produces a result that seems to contradict a central theory, scientists typically blame the experimental conditions, the instruments, the auxiliary assumptions before they revise the central theory. This is not always wrong. Sometimes the auxiliary assumptions really are the problem, but it can become a pathology when the protective belt is maintained not by genuine reasoning, but by the desire to preserve a commitment that is no longer warranted by the evidence.
In everyday life, we all maintain protective belts around our most important beliefs. The belief that a relationship is fundamentally healthy, that our approach to work is sound, that our political framework accurately describes reality. These are surrounded by auxiliary explanations that absorb anomalies. The Bayesian practice is not to abandon core commitments at the first sign of disconfirming evidence. That would be a different kind of error. It is to be genuinely open to the possibility that the anomalies are accumulating in ways that warrant revising the core commitment, and to track that accumulation honestly rather than explaining it away.
Gerd Gigerenzer, the German psychologist who has spent his career studying statistical reasoning and its failures, makes a point that I find both empirically interesting and philosophically important. He argues that many of our probabilistic failures are not failures of human rationality per se, but failures to present information in a format that human minds can process naturally. People are much better at reasoning about frequencies than about probabilities expressed as percentages or decimals. The medical test problem in our opening, expressed as a percentage, it produces systematic confusion. Expressed as a frequency out of 1,000 people tested, how many test positive and actually have the disease? It becomes considerably more tractable.
Gigerenzer's point has practical implications for how we communicate risk and evidence. Doctors who present risk information as frequencies rather than probabilities produce better informed patients. Judges who receive statistical evidence in frequency format make fewer errors than those who receive the same information as probabilities. The format of information matters as much as its content, and designing information environments that work with our cognitive architecture rather than against it is a genuine contribution to public health and public reason, one that does not require changing human nature, but simply changing how we present the facts.
I want to close the substantive part of the episode by connecting probability back to the broader project of this show, to what thinking carefully about probability means for how we live.
The most direct connection is to what we said in the episode on living philosophically. The examined life requires honest inventory. Honest inventory, applied to belief, means holding your beliefs at the confidence level they actually deserve, given the evidence, not at the confidence level that feels comfortable or that protects your identity or that your social group endorses. That is a demanding standard. It means being genuinely uncertain about things you are uncertain about and being willing to say so, even when uncertainty is socially uncomfortable or personally threatening.
It also means being appropriately confident about things you have good reason to believe. Epistemic humility does not mean treating all beliefs as equally uncertain. Some things are well supported by evidence and deserve high confidence. The skill is calibration, matching your confidence level to the quality of your evidence. Overconfidence is a failure of calibration in one direction. Performative uncertainty, claiming not to know things you actually have good grounds to believe, is a failure in the other direction. The Bayesian ideal is neither.
There is also a deep connection to the question of moral judgment. We make probabilistic assessments about people all the time, about their intentions, their character, their reliability, and those assessments are subject to the same biases that affect our probabilistic reasoning in other domains. We anchor on vivid initial impressions. We neglect base rates, the fact that most people are not malicious, most accusations are not fabricated, most anomalies have innocent explanations. We are overconfident in our ability to read people. The Bayesian correction in the domain of moral judgment is not to suspend all judgment, but to hold it more lightly, to update it more readily, and to be more aware of the prior probabilities that should be shaping our interpretation of the evidence.
And finally, there is the question of decisions under uncertainty, which is essentially all important decisions. We rarely have complete information when we need to act. The question is not how to eliminate uncertainty, but how to act wisely in its presence. The Bayesian framework suggests that the right approach is not to wait for certainty that will not come, but to identify your best current estimate of the probabilities, act on that estimate, and remain genuinely open to revising your assessment as new information arrives. That is, in some ways, a mathematical formalization of what William James was arguing for with the will to believe. The courage to commit to your best current estimate while maintaining the intellectual honesty to revise it.
The two orientations are complementary rather than contradictory. James says, do not let the demand for certainty prevent you from acting. Bayes says, make your uncertainty explicit, track it honestly, and update it as the evidence accumulates. Together, they describe a way of being in the world under uncertainty that is both practically workable and epistemically honest, neither paralyzed by doubt nor hardened into false confidence.
There is one more connection worth drawing between probabilistic thinking and the virtue of intellectual humility that has been running through this show since the first episode. Genuine intellectual humility is not the performance of uncertainty. The person who says, I could be wrong about everything as a social ritual while actually holding their beliefs with full confidence. It is the genuine calibration of confidence to evidence that Bayesian reasoning describes. It means being willing to say, I think there is about a 60% chance I am right about this, and I am genuinely open to updating that if the evidence warrants. That kind of explicit, trackable, revisable confidence is both epistemically honest and practically useful. It is what the examined life looks like when it encounters the irreducible uncertainty of being a finite creature in a complex world.
The medical test problem in the opening is the one I keep coming back to because I think it illustrates something important about the relationship between expertise and understanding. The mathematics of the problem is not complicated. A high school student with basic probability skills can work through it, but it routinely trips up doctors, lawyers, and judges, people whose decisions about medical treatment and criminal conviction depend on getting it right. The problem is not lack of mathematical ability. It is the failure to translate abstract statistical principles into concrete reasoning about specific cases.
That gap between knowing a principle and applying it correctly in context is exactly the gap that the examined life is trying to close. And it is not unique to probability. We know that cognitive biases distort our reasoning, but we still fall for them. We know that confirmation bias exists, but we still seek confirming evidence. We know that the availability heuristic misleads us, but we still let vivid examples dominate our risk assessment. Knowledge of the principle does not automatically produce correct application. It requires practice, feedback, and the kind of honest self-monitoring that good probabilistic reasoning demands, and that the philosophical tradition keeps returning to as the core practice of the examined life.
Blaise Pascal, who gave us both probability theory and the wager, was also the author of one of the most quietly devastating observations in the history of philosophy. He wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. That is, on its face, a strange thing for the inventor of probability theory to say, but I think it points at the same thing that Bayesian reasoning points at from the other direction. The examined life requires slowing down, resisting the fast, confident answer, sitting with uncertainty long enough to actually assess it rather than fleeing it. The probability is in the patience.
I want to end with a practical note, because this is an episode that I think rewards application more than most. The next time you encounter a statistic presented as a percentage, a test accuracy rate, a risk reduction claim, a polling figure, try to translate it into a frequency. Out of 1,000 people in this situation, how many would this apply to? Out of 100 exposures, how many would produce this outcome? The frequency format is more cognitively natural and almost always more informative than the percentage. It forces the question of base rates into view rather than letting them be swallowed by the headline figure.
And the next time you find yourself very confident about something, especially something you have strong feelings about, ask, what would it take to change my mind? What evidence would move me? If you cannot answer that question, if there is no imaginable evidence that would revise your belief, that is Popper's criterion for a non-falsifiable claim. It does not necessarily mean the belief is wrong, but it means you are holding it in a way that is immune to evidence and that is worth noticing, because it is the signature of the protective belt working at full strength rather than the examined life working at all.
Next week, we are asking a question that sounds simple and turns out to be one of the deepest in philosophy. Was Epicurus actually an Epicurean? The historical Epicurus argued for a philosophy of moderate pleasure, friendship, and the withdrawal from political ambition. The word Epicurean has come to mean something almost opposite sensual indulgence, luxury, the pursuit of refined pleasure. How that happened, what Epicurus actually taught, and whether his philosophy is a more useful guide to the good life than either his ancient critics or his modern admirers suggest.
If this episode made you want to go back and recalculate a risk you thought you understood, that is exactly what it was designed to do. Share it with someone who is making a decision under uncertainty. That is most people, most of the time.
Sources and further reading are in the show notes.
We are Philosophy for Lunch. New episodes every Monday.
Big ideas, human conversations.
See you next week.